The Galactic Academy of Advanced Sciences hung in space like a glittering metallic spider web. Its crystalline corridors stretching between orbital platforms in a display of engineering that would make any human architect weep with envy. But today, as Professor Liam Voss walked through those pristine halls toward his xenobiology classroom, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was about to pull the rug out from under his feet. Metaphorically speaking, of course. The Academy didn't actually have rugs. Too much of a fire hazard, according to the Velthani safety regulations. "Professor Voss," came a chittering voice behind him, and Liam suppressed a sigh. He'd recognized that particular blend of condescension and barely contained hostility anywhere. It belonged to Academy Director Quacksmoth, a being who looked like someone had crossed a praying mantis with a filing cabinet and then given it delusions of grandeur. "Director," Liam replied, turning with the kind of smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "What a pleasant surprise. Don't tell me. Let me guess. You've come to personally ensure I'm not about to corrupt another batch of promising young minds with my dangerously human approach to education." Quacksmoth's compound eyes glittered with what might have been amusement, if praying mantises were capable of such a thing. "Your sarcasm is noted, Professor. But your concern is not entirely misplaced." The director's translator gave his words a mechanical precision that somehow made them even more ominous. "There have been discussions at the administrative level regarding your methods." "My methods," Liam repeated, hefting his bag of teaching materials a little higher on his shoulder. "You mean the part where I actually teach students to understand alien life forms instead of just cataloging them like museum pieces? The part where you form emotional attachments to specimens that could tear a Zentorian's limbs off without breaking a sweat," came another voice, silky and dangerous. Senior Instructor Velnara emerged from a side corridor like smoke made flesh. If flesh could be purple, scaled, and possessed of entirely too many sharp teeth. She had the kind of predatory grace that made most species instinctively check for the nearest exit. But Liam had long since stopped being impressed by aliens who thought intimidation was a teaching strategy. "Velnara," he said pleasantly. "Still confusing fear with respect, I see. How's that working out for your student retention rates?" Her pupils dilated, the Velkarian equivalent of a middle finger. "My students graduate with a healthy respect for the dangers inherent in xenobiological fieldwork. Yours graduate thinking they can pet a nightmare stalker if they just approach it with enough good intentions. And yet, somehow, my students have a lower casualty rate in the field," Liam pointed out. "Funny how that works." Quacksmoth made a sound that his translator rendered as throat-clearing, though, given that he didn't actually have a throat in any recognizable sense, the effect was somewhat lost. "This brings us to the matter at hand, Professor Voss. The Board of Academic Standards has expressed concerns about your influence on our curriculum." Liam stopped walking. Around them, the hallway bustled with alien students heading to their morning classes, a rainbow coalition of scales, fur, tentacles, and things that defied easy description. A group of young Carthenians chittered excitedly as they passed, their crystalline forms catching the artificial sunlight streaming through the Academy's transparent sections. One of them waved a pseudopod at Liam, who waved back with genuine warmth. "Let me save us all some time," Liam said, turning back to his unwelcome escorts. "You think humans are too emotional to handle dangerous xenofauna properly. You think our tendency to form bonds with other species makes us liability rather than an asset. And you're looking for an excuse to demonstrate this to the broader academic community, probably in a way that involves me looking incompetent and ideally suffering some kind of minor but embarrassing injury." The silence that followed was the kind you could have carved with a knife. Velnara's scales shifted color slightly, a tell that Liam had learned to recognize during their previous encounters. She was annoyed that he'd figured out their game so quickly. "Your paranoia is showing, Professor," she said finally. "My pattern recognition is showing," Liam corrected. "There's a difference. But hey, I appreciate the heads up. Most assassination attempts don't come with this much advance warning." "Assassination?" Cocksmoth's mandibles clicked rapidly, the equivalent of nervous laughter. "Professor Voss, you dramatically overestimate the importance of your position here. We merely wish to observe your teaching methods in action. Today, in fact, during your Advanced Predator Behavior seminar." And there it was. Liam felt something cold settle in his stomach. Not fear, exactly, but the kind of wariness that had kept his species alive long enough to reach the stars in the first place. "How thoughtful of you. I don't suppose this observation will be purely academic in nature." "Of course," Velnara said, and her smile revealed entirely too many teeth. "We simply wish to see how you handle challenging specimens in a controlled environment." "Challenging specimens," Liam repeated, "in a classroom full of students." "The Academy has safety protocols," Cocksmoth assured him. "Nothing will be released that poses a genuine threat to student welfare." Liam looked between them, noting the way Velnara's tail was twitching and the almost imperceptible vibration in Cocksmoth's antennae. Body language was a universal constant, apparently. Even across species lines, guilty parties had tells. "Right," he said slowly. "And I'm sure these protocols were developed with human reflexes and human physiology in mind." "The Academy maintains species-neutral safety standards," Cocksmoth said, which wasn't really an answer, and they all knew it. "Species-neutral," Liam mused, "like the way our cafeteria serves species-neutral food that somehow manages to be mildly poisonous to humans while being perfectly nutritious for everyone else." "That was an unfortunate oversight in the menu planning," Velnara said dismissively. "Hardly relevant to the current discussion." "No, you're right. Completely different situation. That was just negligent incompetence. This sounds like malicious incompetence, which is so much better." The artificial gravity hummed around them, a subtle reminder that they were all living in a metal can suspended in the void, dependent on technology and cooperation for survival. It was the kind of thing that usually made species-level politics seem petty and short-sighted. Usually. "Your class begins in 20 minutes, Cocksmoth observed. "Perhaps you should prepare." "Oh, I'm prepared," Liam said. "The question is whether you are." He walked away before they could respond, leaving them standing in the corridor like a pair of conspirators who just realized their target might not be as helpless as they'd assumed. Behind him, he could hear the soft whisper of Velnara's scales against the wall and the barely audible click of Cocksmoth's mandibles, the alien equivalent of nervous muttering. Liam's classroom was located in the Academy's Biological Sciences Wing, a section of the station that was kept at slightly higher humidity and lower light levels to accommodate the various specimens and experiments housed there. The walls were lined with containment units, observation tanks, and holographic displays showing everything from microscopic organisms to creatures that defied easy classification. As he entered the room, Liam was greeted by the sight of his students arranging themselves in their preferred seating configurations. The Carthenians had claimed their usual spot near the light panels, their crystalline forms refracting rainbow patterns across the ceiling. A small group of Velcarians, distant cousins of Velnara, though considerably less hostile, had positioned themselves near the back, where they could keep an eye on all the exits. The lone Centaurian in the class, A gentle giant, named something that human vocal cords couldn't properly pronounce, had folded itself into a space that was technically large enough for its frame, but looked uncomfortable by any reasonable standard. "Good morning, everyone," Liam said, setting his bag down on the instructor's desk. "I hope you've all been keeping up with your reading, because today's lesson is going to be interactive." A ripple of excitement went through the room. Liam's interactive lessons were something of a legend at the academy, partly because they were genuinely educational, and partly because they had a tendency to result in minor chaos that somehow never quite escalated to actual disaster. "Now, before we begin," Liam continued, glancing up at the observation gallery where he could see the familiar silhouettes of Coxmoth and Velnara taking their seats, "I should mention that we have some distinguished guests joining us today. They're here to observe our teaching methods and ensure that we're maintaining proper academic standards." Several students followed his gaze to the gallery. The Carthenians chimed softly, their equivalent of nervous laughter. The Velkarians' scales shifted to more muted colors, a sign of wariness. Even the normally unflappable Zentorian seemed to tense slightly. "Don't worry," Liam said with a grin that was equal parts reassurance and challenge. "I'm sure they have only the best intentions. After all, what could possibly go wrong?" In the observation gallery above, he could see Velnara's tail beginning to twitch with anticipation. Whatever they had planned, it was about to begin. And despite everything, the obvious setup, the political maneuvering, the barely concealed hostility from his supposed colleagues, Liam found himself looking forward to it. After all, he'd been teaching xenobiology for 3 years now, and in that time he'd learned something that apparently had escaped the notice of the Academy's administration. The most dangerous predators in the galaxy weren't the ones with the biggest teeth or the sharpest claws. They were the ones who underestimated their prey. Liam pulled up his holographic display with a theatrical flourish that would have made a Vegas magician proud. The three-dimensional image that materialized above his desk showed a complex ecosystem in miniature, complete with rotating food webs, predator-prey relationships mapped in glowing lines, and environmental factors pulsing like a heartbeat through the virtual landscape. "Today, we're going to discuss the fundamental principles of predator behavior," he announced, his voice carrying easily through the acoustically engineered classroom. "Specifically, the difference between learned aggression and natural hunting instincts. It's a distinction that most xenobiologists completely miss, which is why half of them end up as somebody's lunch." A few students chittered with amusement. The Carthenians, in particular, seemed to enjoy Liam's slightly morbid sense of humor, probably because their own species had evolved from something that looked like a cross between a crystal formation and a very patient spider. Now, who can tell me the primary difference between a predator that's been raised in captivity versus one that's developed natural hunting behaviors in the wild? Several tentacles, pseudopods, and appendages that defied easy classification shot up around the room. Liam pointed to one of the Velkarians, a young female whose scales were currently displaying the deep blue pattern that indicated academic enthusiasm. Captive-raised predators often display more aggressive behavior patterns, she said, her voice carrying the musical undertones that made her species such excellent singers when they weren't busy being terrifying. They lack the social conditioning that comes from pack interaction and environmental adaptation. "Excellent," Liam said, and meant it. "And why is this significant from a xenobiological perspective?" "Because," came a rumbling voice from the back of the room, the Zentorian speaking slowly and deliberately as his species always did, "captive aggression is often misdirected fear response, not true predatory behavior." Right again. Liam expanded the holographic display, showing behavioral pattern comparisons between wild and captive specimens of various species. Captive predators are essentially traumatized individuals acting out learned responses to stress. Wild predators, on the other hand, hunt because they need to eat, defend territory, or protect their young. Their aggression has purpose and context. In the observation gallery above, he could see Coxmoth leaning forward slightly, his compound eyes focused on something beyond the classroom. Velnara was checking a handheld device, probably monitoring whatever surprise they had planned for him. This brings us to an interesting question, Liam continued, his voice taking on a slightly sharper edge. What happens when you take captive-raised predators and suddenly expose them to a completely unfamiliar environment? Say, hypothetically, a classroom full of potential prey species? The temperature in the room seemed to drop a few degrees. Several students shifted nervously in their seats, suddenly aware that their professor's tone had changed from educational to something that sounded almost like a warning. Theoretically speaking, one of the Carthenians chimed, such predators would likely experience heightened stress responses, leading to unpredictable and potentially dangerous behavior patterns. Theoretically, yes, Liam agreed. Though, of course, no responsible educational institution would ever actually test such a hypothesis in a live classroom environment. That would be criminally negligent. The silence that followed was broken by a soft hissing sound. Barely audible, but unmistakable to anyone who'd spent time around the Academy's biological containment systems, it was the sound of pressure seals disengaging. Liam's students heard it too. The Carthenians' crystalline forms began to resonate with a high-pitched harmonic that indicated alarm. The Velkarians' scales shifted rapidly through color spectrums that had no human equivalent, but universally meant, oh no, oh no, oh no. Even the normally placid Zentaurian was beginning to unfold himself from his seat, moving with the kind of deliberate urgency that his species displayed only in genuine emergencies. Well, Liam said conversationally, not bothering to look around for the source of the sound. It seems today's lesson is going to be even more interactive than I anticipated. The containment barriers around the classroom's perimeter shimmered once, twice, and then winked out of existence entirely. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, from the environmental conditioning vents near the ceiling, came a sound that made every sentient being in the room freeze in terror. It was halfway between a growl and a purr, with undertones that suggested the creature making it had never met anything it couldn't kill if it put its mind to it. The sound repeated, joined by others, 5 more voices joining the first in a chorus that spoke of claws and teeth, and the kind of predatory intelligence that had kept certain species at the top of food chains across a dozen different worlds. "Shadowclaw cubs," breathed one of the Velkarians, and her scales went completely white, the equivalent of a human turning ghost pale. 6 of them, by the sound, Liam observed calmly. Juvenile, but old enough to have developed their hunting instincts, probably raised in isolation to maximize aggressive responses. A panel in the ceiling slid open, and the first of the creatures dropped into the classroom with the fluid grace of liquid nightmare. Shadowclaws were bipedal, roughly wolf-sized, with elongated limbs that ended in retractable claws capable of cutting through standard hull plating. Their hide was a deep matte black that seemed to absorb light, broken only by the distinctive silver striping that gave them their name. Most disturbing of all were their eyes, multifaceted like an insect's, but with an unmistakable intelligence behind them that suggested they were capable of planning, strategizing, and holding grudges. The first cub landed in a crouch, head swiveling as it assessed the room full of potential prey. Its nostrils flared, sampling scents and pheromones that would tell it which species were most afraid, most vulnerable, most likely to run. It was joined by a second, then a third, each one taking up position around the classroom with the kind of tactical awareness that suggested they'd been trained for exactly this kind of scenario. By the time all six had entered the room, they had effectively surrounded the students, cutting off access to the main exits. The panic response was immediate and predictable. The Carthenians began resonating at frequencies that would have shattered glass if the classroom hadn't been designed to contain them. Several of the Velkarians scrambled for the elevated seating areas, their natural climbing abilities giving them a temporary advantage. The Zentorian simply stood motionless, apparently hoping that his size would make him less appealing as a target. In the observation gallery above, Liam could see Coxmoth and Velnara leaning forward with undisguised anticipation. This was it. The moment they expected him to panic, to lose control, to prove once and for all that humans were too emotionally unstable to handle dangerous xenofauna. Instead, Liam did something that apparently no one in the room had expected. He sat down. Not quickly, not frantically, not with the jerky movements of someone trying to make themselves a smaller target. He simply walked to the center of the classroom, lowered himself cross-legged to the floor, and placed his hands palm down on his knees in a posture of complete relaxation. The effect on the Shadow Claw cubs was immediate and startling. Their aggressive posturing faltered, heads tilting in confusion as they tried to process this unexpected behavior. In their limited experience, prey species either ran or fought. They didn't sit down and start looking contemplative. "That's interesting," Liam said, his voice carrying clearly through the chaos around him. He wasn't addressing his students or the observers in the gallery. He was talking to the cubs themselves, his tone conversational and completely unthreatened. "You know, I've been studying your species for about 2 years now, but I've never had the chance to observe social behavior patterns in juveniles. This is quite an opportunity." One of the cubs, slightly larger than the others, probably the pack leader, took a cautious step forward. Its claws remained extended, but its posture had shifted from actively aggressive to merely suspicious. The creature's multifaceted eyes were focused entirely on Liam, trying to categorize him according to threat assessment parameters that apparently didn't have a category for calm human sitting on the floor. "You're scared," Liam observed, and several of his students stopped their panicked scrambling to stare at him in disbelief. "Oh, you're trying very hard not to show it, but it's written all over your body language. Ears back, shoulders hunched, claws extended in defensive rather than offensive posture. You were expecting a different kind of reaction, weren't you?" The lead cub took another step forward, close enough now that Liam could have reached out and touched its snout if he'd been so inclined. Instead, he remained perfectly still, watching as the creature's aggressive conditioning warred with its natural curiosity. "The thing about captive-raised predators," Liam continued, speaking as much to his students as to the cubs themselves, "is that they're usually more afraid than the creatures they're supposed to be hunting. They've been taught that everything is either a threat or prey, with no middle ground. But humans—" He smiled, and it was the kind of expression that suggested he was genuinely enjoying himself. "Humans don't fit neatly into those categories, do we?" The lead cub was close enough now that Liam could see individual striations in its silver markings. Up close, the creature was actually quite beautiful. Sleek and deadly, yes, but with an elegance that spoke of millions of years of evolutionary refinement. "You've never encountered anything like me before," Liam said softly. "I'm not running, so I'm not prey. I'm not attacking, So I'm not a rival. I'm just sitting here, completely unthreatened by 6 apex predators who could tear me apart without breaking a sweat. What does that make me? The answer, apparently, was fascinating. The lead cub had stopped entirely now, its head tilted at an angle that suggested intense concentration. Behind it, the other 5 were beginning to abandon their aggressive stances, drawn by their leader's obvious confusion and their own natural curiosity. In the observation gallery, Liam could see Coxmoth's mandibles clicking rapidly, the alien equivalent of sputtering indignation. This was definitely not going according to plan. The lead cub was close enough now that Liam could feel the warmth radiating from its body, a detail that most xenobiology textbooks fail to mention about shadow claws. They weren't the cold, mechanical killers that popular media portrayed. They were warm-blooded, social creatures with complex emotional responses that had been systematically suppressed by whoever had raised them. "You know what I think?" Liam said, still maintaining his relaxed posture, despite being within easy striking distance of claws that could open him up like a can of soup. "I think you're exhausted. Being afraid all the time is tiring work, isn't it?" The cub's ears twitched, a minute movement that most observers would have missed, but Liam had spent enough time studying alien body language to recognize it as a sign of emotional response. The creature was actually listening to him, processing not just his words but the tone and intent behind them. Around the classroom, his students remained frozen in various states of panic and disbelief. The Carthenians had stopped their harmonic resonance, but were still clustered near the light panels, their crystalline forms refracting nervous patterns across the walls. The Valkyrians had achieved temporary safety on the elevated seating platforms, but their scales continued to shift through color spectrums that indicated they expected imminent carnage. "The thing about fear conditioning," Liam continued, his voice taking on the gentle cadence he usually reserved for explaining complex concepts to struggling students, "is that it's incredibly effective in the short term. Scare a young predator badly enough, often enough, and you can turn them into a weapon. But it comes at a cost." The lead cub took another step forward, and Liam could see its nostrils flaring as it sampled his scent. Whatever chemical signatures it was detecting apparently didn't match any of its trained responses, because its confusion was becoming more apparent by the moment. "The cost is that you break their natural social instincts," Liam explained. "Shadow claws are pack hunters in the wild. They have complex hierarchies, family structures, even what we might recognize as friendship bonds. But raise them in isolation, condition them with fear and aggression, and you turn them into something they were never meant to be." One of the other cubs, smaller than the leader, with silver markings that formed an intricate spiral pattern along its flanks, had begun edging closer as well. Its approach was more tentative, almost hesitant, as if it was fighting against programming that told it to attack anything that moved. "You're not weapons," Liam said, and his voice carried a note of genuine sadness that seemed to resonate with something deep in the creature's psyche. "You're children. Scared, confused children who've been taught that the whole galaxy is something to be afraid of." The lead cub was close enough now that Liam could have reached out and touched it without extending his arm fully. Instead, he remained perfectly still, letting the creature make its own choices about distance and proximity. The concept of voluntary interaction was apparently so foreign to the cub's experience that they seemed genuinely unsure how to process it. "Professor Voss," came a trembling voice from somewhere behind him, one of the Valkyrians, probably the young female who'd answered his earlier question about captive predator behavior. "What are you doing?" "I'm teaching," Liam replied without turning around. "This is what actual predator behavior looks like when you remove the artificial conditioning." Watch their body language. Ears forward now, not back. Claws partially retracted. They're curious, not aggressive. The spiral-marked cub had gotten close enough to sniff at Liam's left shoulder, its warm breath tickling the back of his neck. The sensation was actually rather pleasant, like being investigated by an oversized cat with better dental hygiene. In the wild, Liam continued, apparently oblivious to the fact that he was now serving as a scent reference for apex predators, young shadow claws spend months learning social cues from their pack elders. They learn when to hunt, when to rest, when to play, when to show submission or dominance. It's a complex behavioral matrix that takes time and patience to develop. A third cub had joined the investigation party, this one approaching from Liam's right side with the kind of cautious curiosity that reminded him irresistibly of a puppy encountering a new smell. The comparison was probably not scientifically accurate, but it was psychologically comforting. These cubs have been denied that natural development process, Liam said, his tone becoming more professorial even as his situation became increasingly surreal. They've been isolated, conditioned to see everything as a threat, and then released into an environment they have no framework for understanding. The result is confusion, not aggression. The lead cub had settled into a crouch beside Liam's left knee, its multifaceted eyes still fixed on his face, with an intensity that suggested it was trying to solve a puzzle that defied all its previous experience. The other two were positioning themselves similarly, drawn by some instinct that apparently trumped their conditioning. "Professor," came another voice, the deep rumbling tones of the Zentorian. Are they purring?" Liam paused, listening carefully to the soft, rhythmic vibration that was indeed emanating from the cubs around him. It was a sound that no xenobiologist had ever reported hearing from a shadow claw, mainly because no xenobiologist had ever been in a position to observe relaxed, comfortable shadow claw behavior. "I believe they are," he said with genuine delight. "That's fascinating. It suggests that their natural social bonding instincts are still intact, just suppressed by their conditioning. The purring response indicates contentment and social acceptance. They're treating me as a pack member rather than prey or threat." The remaining three cubs had abandoned their perimeter positions and were moving closer, drawn by the obvious contentment of their pack mates and their own natural curiosity about this strange creature who refused to behave according to their programmed expectations. "This is impossible," came a new voice, harsh, mechanical, and filled with barely controlled fury. Velnara had apparently decided that the situation had strayed too far from her carefully laid plans, and was now speaking through the classroom's communication system from the observation gallery above. "Senior Instructor Velnara," Liam said pleasantly, not bothering to look up as a fourth cub settled beside his right knee. "How nice of you to join our discussion. I was just explaining to my students how fear-based conditioning can be overcome through patient, non-threatening interaction." "Those creatures are trained killers," Velnara snapped. "They've been conditioned for maximum aggression response." "Yes, they have," Liam agreed, "and it's been cruel and unnecessary. Shadow claws are naturally social creatures with strong pack-bonding instincts. The aggressive conditioning you're referring to is essentially a form of psychological torture that's turned them into something they were never meant to be." A fifth cub had joined the growing circle around Liam, and the soft purring sound was now a harmonic chorus that filled the classroom with unexpected warmth. The creatures were pressed against him on all sides now, their body heat creating a cocoon of comfort that was probably the first genuine peace they'd experienced since being separated from their birth pack. "This is not a natural response," Cocksmoth's voice joined the conversation, his tone carrying the kind of mechanical precision that suggested he was trying very hard not to lose his composure entirely. Shadow claws are apex predators. They do not form attachments to prey species. "You're absolutely right," Liam said, and his smile was audible in his voice, even though most of the room couldn't see his face through the circle of cubs. "They don't form attachments to prey species. The fact that they're responding to me this way suggests that they don't see me as prey. They see me as something else entirely." The sixth and final cub, the smallest of the group, with silver markings that looked almost like delicate filigree, had overcome its hesitation and was now pressed against Liam's back, its purring adding another layer to the harmonic chorus that had transformed the classroom's acoustic environment. "But what do they see you as?" asked one of his students, the question coming from somewhere in the elevated seating area where the Valkyrians had taken refuge. Liam considered this for a moment, surrounded by warm, purring apex predators who had apparently decided that he was the most interesting thing they'd encountered in their short, traumatic lives. "Pack leader, maybe," he said finally. "Or possibly just the first adult they've met who wasn't actively afraid of them. Fear is a scent, you know. Every species produces chemical markers when they're terrified, and predators are evolutionarily designed to detect and respond to those markers. But I'm not afraid of them." "You should be." Velnara's voice was tight with frustration. "Those creatures could kill you in seconds." "Yes, they could," Liam agreed amiably. "But they won't. Not because they can't, but because they have no reason to. I'm not threatening them. I'm not trying to dominate them, and I'm not broadcasting fear pheromones that trigger their attack responses. I'm just here, present, calm, and unthreatening." The purring chorus had reached a volume that was almost musical, a complex harmonic that seemed to resonate through the classroom structure itself. Several of his students had begun to relax slightly, drawn out of their panic by the obvious contentment of the creatures that had terrorized them moments before. "This is what Shadow Claw social behavior actually looks like," Liam announced to the room at large, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a teacher who just delivered the perfect practical demonstration. Not the artificial aggression created by fear conditioning, but their natural pack-bonding instincts. They're incredibly social creatures when given the opportunity to express their true nature. In the observation gallery above, he could hear the sound of heated argument, Coxmoth and Velnara apparently debating what to do about a demonstration that had gone so completely off script that it had become educational instead of destructive. "The question now," Liam continued, apparently oblivious to the administrative crisis he'd created, "is what we do with this information. These cubs have been psychologically damaged by their conditioning. But, as you can see, the damage isn't irreversible. With proper socialization and care, they could potentially be rehabilitated into functional members of their species." "Rehabilitated?" Velnara's voice had reached a pitch that the translator was having trouble rendering into human-audible frequencies. "Professor Voss, those are military-grade bioweapons, not classroom pets." "Actually," Liam said, reaching up to gently scratch behind the ears of the lead cub, who leaned into the contact with obvious pleasure, "I think you'll find that they're students, just like everyone else in this room." The harmonic purring of 6 contentedly bonded Shadow Claw cubs created an acoustic environment so peaceful that several students had actually begun descending from their panic positions. The Carthenians were resonating in harmonious counterpoint, their crystalline forms creating visual light patterns that complemented the cubs' vocalizations. Even the normally cautious Valkyrians were edging closer, their scales shifting to the deep green hues that indicated scientific curiosity overcoming survival instincts. Liam remained at the center of it all, surrounded by warm predator bodies that had effectively turned him into the galaxy's most dangerous living teddy bear. The lead cub had actually rested its head on his shoulder, a gesture of trust so profound that it would have been touching if it weren't coming from a creature capable of decapitating most sentient species without breaking stride. "This is absolutely fascinating," breathed one of the Carthenians, their voice creating crystal chimes of wonder. "Professor, how did you know they would respond this way?" "I didn't," Liam admitted, gently stroking the flank of the spiral-marked cub that had claimed real estate against his left side. "But I understood something that apparently escaped our esteemed administrators. Fear creates fear. Aggression creates aggression. Calm creates calm." The classroom door burst open with a bang that would have sent the cubs into attack mode an hour ago. Now they barely lifted their heads, too comfortable and secure in their new pack dynamic to be startled by sudden noises. Director Coxmoth stormed in, his compound eyes whirring with mechanical fury, followed closely by Velnara, whose scales had shifted to the deep crimson that indicated she was roughly 30 seconds away from attempted homicide. "Professor Voss," Coxmoth announced, his voice carrying the kind of official authority that worked wonderfully on paperwork, but seemed laughably inadequate in the current situation. "You will step away from those creatures immediately." "Will I?" Liam asked pleasantly, not making any move to disturb the cubs who had apparently decided that he made an excellent piece of furniture. "And why exactly would I do that?" "Because," Velnara snapped, pulling out some kind of handheld device that was probably a neural disruptor or tranquilizer or something equally unpleasant, "those creatures are dangerous military assets, not therapy animals." "Dangerous military assets," Liam repeated, his voice taking on the kind of thoughtful tone that his students had learned to recognize as the prelude to a devastating logical argument. "Tell me, Velnara, what exactly makes them dangerous?" "They're trained killers," she said, as if explaining something obvious to a slow child. "No," Liam corrected. "They're traumatized children who've been conditioned to respond with violence because that's the only response they've been taught. There's a difference." He gestured to the cubs around him, who were still purring with the kind of contentment usually reserved for creatures who'd found the perfect sunny spot for an afternoon nap. "Look at them. Really look. Do these seem like weapons to you?" Coxmoth's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sound that his translator rendered as frustrated stammering. This is not the intended outcome of today's demonstration." "Oh, I'm sure it's not," Liam said, and his smile was sharp enough to cut hull plating. "I imagine the intended outcome involved me being terrorized, probably injured, certainly discredited, and ideally removed from my position for being too emotionally compromised to handle dangerous specimens properly." The silence that followed was so complete that the only sound in the room was the soft purring of 6 apex predators who had apparently decided that graduate-level xenobiology was the perfect soundtrack for a nap. "The thing is," Liam continued, scratching behind the ears of the lead cub, who leaned into the contact with obvious bliss, "your little demonstration has actually proven the opposite of what you intended. These cubs aren't inherently dangerous. They're the products of systematic abuse, designed to turn them into weapons. And the reason they've bonded with me so completely isn't because I have some mystical human power over predators. It's because I'm the first adult they've encountered who wasn't trying to hurt them or use them." "This is preposterous," Velnara hissed. "Shadowclaws don't form interspecies bonds." "Wild shadowclaws don't usually have the opportunity," Liam corrected, But these aren't wild shadow claws. They're institutionalized victims who've been denied every aspect of normal social development. When presented with genuine kindness instead of fear or aggression, they respond exactly the way any intelligent social species would, with gratitude and attachment. One of his students, the young Velkarian female who'd answered his earlier questions, raised a tentative appendage. "Professor, does this mean the cubs could be rehabilitated?" "That's exactly what it means," Liam said, his voice warming with genuine enthusiasm. "With proper socialization, environmental enrichment, and most importantly, consistent non-threatening contact with various species, these cubs could develop into functional members of Shadowclaw society. They might even become ambassadors between their species and the broader galactic community." "Absolutely not," Coxmoth declared, his translator struggling to render the mechanical fury in his voice. "These specimens are classified military assets. They cannot be—" "They cannot be what?" Liam interrupted. And suddenly, his voice carried the kind of quiet intensity that made everyone in the room pay attention. "They cannot be treated with basic decency. They cannot be given the chance to develop into what they were meant to be, instead of what you've tried to force them to become." He stood up slowly, careful not to disturb the cubs who adjusted their positions to maintain contact with him as he rose. 6 pairs of multifaceted eyes tracked his movement, but there was no aggression in their posture, only the kind of devoted attention that pack members showed to their chosen leader. "Let me tell you something about humans," Liam said, and his voice carried across the classroom with the kind of clarity that came from 3 years of lecturing to diverse audiences. "We don't see weapons when we look at traumatized children. We see individuals who deserve better than what they've been given. And when we encounter systematic abuse disguised as training, we don't just stand by and let it continue." "You cannot interfere with Academy protocols," Velnara warned, but her voice lacked its earlier conviction. The sight of 6 apex predators treating a human as their pack leader was apparently forcing her to reconsider some fundamental assumptions about interspecies dynamics. "Academy protocols," Liam repeated, and laughed, not with humor but with the kind of bitter amusement that suggested he'd finally heard something absurd enough to break his composure. "You mean the protocols that thought it was acceptable to release terrified, conditioned predators into a classroom full of students as some kind of twisted loyalty test?" He gestured to his students, many of whom were now watching the proceedings with fascination rather than fear. "Did any of your protocols account for what would have happened if these cubs had actually attacked? Did you have medical teams standing by? Evacuation procedures? Or were you just hoping that any casualties would be minor enough to cover up?" The silence from the observation gallery was answer enough. "I thought so," Liam said. "Which means that your protocols were actually a poorly planned attempt to discredit me that could have resulted in serious injuries or deaths among the student body. I'm sure the Galactic Education Board will be fascinated to hear about this when I file my report." "You wouldn't dare," Coxmoth said, but his translator couldn't quite hide the uncertainty in his voice. "Try me," Liam replied cheerfully. "I've got 6 witnesses to your little setup, a classroom full of students who can testify about what actually happened, and security footage that will show exactly who authorized the release of conditioned predators into an active learning environment." The lead cub chose that moment to nuzzle against Liam's hand, producing a contented rumble that sounded remarkably similar to laughter. The effect on the room was immediate. Several students actually smiled, and even the normally stoic Zentaurian made a sound that might have been amusement. "Besides," Liam continued, "I think the board will be very interested in the educational potential demonstrated here today. These cubs have shown remarkable capacity for social learning and, Interspecies bonding. They could revolutionize our understanding of predator rehabilitation and interspecies communication. "You want to keep them," Belnara said, and she sounded genuinely incredulous. "I want to give them the chance to become what they were meant to be," Liam corrected, which, as it turns out, is not weapons or monsters or military assets. They're intelligent, social beings who deserve the opportunity to develop natural relationships with other species. He looked around the classroom, taking in the faces of his students, no longer terrified, but engaged and curious about the creatures that had transformed from threats into teaching aids in the span of an hour. "In fact," Liam said, his grin spreading wider, "I think they're going to make excellent teaching assistants. Nothing quite like hands-on experience with apex predators to really drive home the principles of xenobiological behavioral analysis." "This is madness," Coxmoth declared. "This is education," Liam replied, "the kind that actually works, as opposed to the fear-based approach that's been failing spectacularly for decades." As if to emphasize his point, all 6 cubs began purring in harmony again, creating a sound so peaceful and contented that it seemed to settle over the classroom like a warm blanket. Several students were actually taking notes now, documenting what was probably the first recorded instance of voluntary Shadowclaw social bonding in academic history. "Gentlemen and lady," Liam said, addressing the administrative officials with the kind of polite formality that barely concealed complete victory, "I believe this concludes today's lesson. Unless, of course, you'd like to stick around for the practical examination portion, where my students get to observe pack hierarchy establishment in real time." The cubs shifted slightly, and while their movements remained completely non-threatening, there was something in their positioning that suggested they were very much aware of the tension in the room and very much prepared to support their chosen pack leader if the situation required it. "This isn't over, Professor Voss," Velnara said, backing toward the door. "You're absolutely right," Liam agreed cheerfully. "It's just beginning. After all, someone's going to need to design a proper rehabilitation program for institutionalized predator species. I can't think of anyone more qualified for the job, can you?" As the administrative officials retreated, defeated by the simple power of kindness over fear, Liam settled back down among his new teaching assistants. The cubs immediately resumed their protective circle, purring with the satisfaction of creatures who had finally found where they belonged. "Well, class," he said to his students, who were already pulling out recording devices to document this historic moment, "I think we can safely say that today's lesson in predator behavior has been illuminating." And somewhere in his jacket pocket, his personal communicator was already composing the message he'd send to his girlfriend later. "Honey, I can explain about the apex predators, but you're going to want to sit down first."